Hello and welcome to Hudson Institute. For today's event, we're going to be talking about McKinsey in China. My name is Nate Sibley. I'm a research fellow at Hudson Institute, and I run something called the Kleptocracy Initiative, when we conduct policy research on how transnational corruption is sort of reshaping global politics and security. Joining me today, though, is Michael Forsythe. He's a New York Times investigative reporter and co-author with Walt Bogdanich of the new book, When McKinsey Comes to Town, The Hidden Influence of the World's Most Powerful Consulting Firm. It's just been published by Penguin Random House, and you can order it now. It covers everything from McKinsey's work with authoritarian governments around the world to its role in fueling the US opioid crisis. But as I said, we'll be focusing particularly on the firm's activities in China today. I should say, because it might come up later, that Mike is also a US Navy veteran, served as a navigator with the 7th Fleet in the South China Sea during the 1990s. But Mike, I know you, and we've sort of interacted before. And your role as a sort of dogged investigator of the Chinese elite's private wealth. For example, you famously exposed Xi Jinping's extended family's fortune when you were working at Bloomberg back in 2012. So I wanted to start by just asking quickly, was this sort of a China project? It's only one chapter in a much bigger book, as I mentioned. So was this a China project that turned into a McKinsey project, or was it the other way around? How did you come to focus on McKinsey as the subject of your new book?
So it was definitely a McKinsey project that turned into a China project. We started, my colleague Walt Bogdanich and I started researching McKinsey back in 2018. And we were first focused on South Africa. And in the course of reporting that story, it was quite obvious that a lot of the big state-owned companies in South Africa were doing a lot of contracting with state-owned companies in China. And it also became obvious very quickly that McKinsey was deeply involved in China, something I didn't know too much about. I knew they were there because I had lived in China, in Beijing for 8 years myself, and had come across McKinsey in the course of reporting. But then back then, we wanted to learn more about that work as part of that story, and started looking at McKinsey's clients in China back then.
So before we proceed and start talking about them, maybe just a bit of a background. What actually is McKinsey, just for those who are sort of stumbling across this event? Because management consultancy firms are sort of notoriously, some of the language they use is a bit sort of nebulous and is sometimes a bit unclear what they actually kind of do at their desks all day. So what is McKinsey? What does it do all day? What is its organizational culture? If you could talk a bit about that, sort of the opening couple of chapters of your book.
That's right. So McKinsey is, as you said, it's a management consulting company. It's been around almost 100 years. It's got a little more than 30,000 employees, many in the United States, but actually most of their employees are outside of the United States, all over the world, more than 60 countries. And they provide advice, and that's very vague. It can be anything from cost cutting for a corporation, or one of the things they specialize in is finding out what works best, for an organization someplace, and moving that information, teaching one of their clients about those best practices. That is particularly important in China, where, for the last few decades, China has been very thirsty to find out about how foreign companies, US companies, European companies work. What are the things that make them tick? And McKinsey has been one of the instruments of moving that knowledge over to China. One example we talk about in the book is this company called Ping An Insurance. And so, McKinsey for decades had been working with insurance companies, learning how they work, finding out what works best for them, how they can make the highest profits and operate the most efficiently. And they were hired by Ping An over many decades, actually, to maybe transfer some of that knowledge over to China. So they do so many things with clients. They get some of the smartest people in the world from Ivy League institutions, Oxbridge, to work for them. Famously, Pete Buttigieg, who was a Rhodes Scholar, and a Harvard grad, went to work for him, maybe infamously. It got a lot of publicity. And those people work just tirelessly, for their clients, doing what their clients want them to do. And that's the whole crux of our book, is that, yes, McKinsey works really hard. And so you can joke all you want about some of the anodyne phrases that come out on PowerPoint slides about McKinsey. But what we found in the book is they really do have an impact. But sometimes the clients they pick are not good actors. And when you have some of the smartest people in the world working tirelessly for a client that may not have the world's best interests at heart, that can do real harm. And that's something that we write about in the book.
Well, let's get on to that then and start talking a bit about their work in China. Let's start at the beginning. How did McKinsey first come to China? What were they presumably didn't show up there the past few years because it takes a long time to establish the kind of business relationships that make you successful in China. So could you give us a potted history of McKinsey in China up to the past few years?
Yeah, so obviously there was not a lot of interest in China or McKinsey for any work for many decades, under Chairman Mao. Starting in the 70s and the 80s, China did approach McKinsey to do some work. Bank of China approached McKinsey, and so did the government on some steel issues, but McKinsey turned it down. They didn't think they could make any difference in this, very socialist Leninist state, right? But then when China started opening up, McKinsey started going in, and this would have been in the 1990s. And so McKinsey didn't even have an office in mainland China until the mid-1990s. It had been in Hong Kong since the mid-80s. But at that point, that coincided, with a lot of foreign companies coming into China. The big ones, General Motors, Volkswagen, General Electric, all these guys, they needed help for their China operations to get them going, to give them advice on how to work in China. And also Chinese companies, were starting to come to McKinsey for advice on how to get up to global standards. And especially as some of these big state-owned companies in the 90s started to look at international stock market, listings, they needed to get up to speed. McKinsey was there to help them reformulate, reorganize their organizations to get to international standards.
So, you mentioned there was a sort of rush of companies to go and work in China during this period. And many of them are still there, the big multinationals. We hear, we'll talk a bit about it later on, maybe, but, some of the big ones, you mentioned in the book, BMW, Apple, Boeing, Starbucks, there's all, McKinsey's not alone in being, deeply sort of embedded in China. Mm-hmm. But what is sort of different about the service that McKinsey offers? What's significant about what McKinsey does compared to those other big firms who are predominantly manufacturers, right?
Yeah.
What does McKinsey do that's so potentially problematic that will sort of frame what we talk about in a minute?
Right. And I mean, it's pretty easy to make a strong case, I think, that Ford and General Motors, Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, Starbucks, these kind of companies should be in China. It's a matter of their bottom line. They're mostly making money there. It's, the biggest car market in the world. I think, it's, if not the biggest, the second biggest market for Starbucks. They converted China into a nation of coffee drinkers. A bunch of tea drinkers became coffee drinkers. So, there's a justification for that. There's a simplicity to their business model. They sell things. McKinsey is so different. Because what McKinsey sells, as we said, is advice. And because McKinsey takes on so many clients, they are often providing advice and actually drumming up, working for state-owned companies in China, which I focus in the chapter. We focus in the chapter on the 96 companies that are the centrally administered state-owned enterprises, the Zhongyang Qiyie in Chinese. So these companies, their heads are appointed by the organization department of the Communist Party. And our research has found that at least 26 of those 96 have been McKinsey clients, over the last decade or so. That's at least, based on some internal records we have, and on what's publicly available. And so they provide advice to these instruments of the Chinese state, instruments of state power. These are the oil companies, the infrastructure companies, that are the basis of Chinese state power. And they're helping these companies, as we talk about in the chapter. And they're also, and this is so interesting, in the last decade or so, they've also been talking up in their reports some of these marquee Chinese policies and actually talking to clients about them. And one of them is the Belt and Road Policy. This is, the $1 trillion plan to build infrastructure, ports, roads, railroads across Asia into Africa. And McKinsey has been touting this basically in their reports and actually talking to clients around the world about why maybe you should, in one case in Malaysia, why you should maybe go with a Chinese SOE to build your infrastructure, because you'll really help your relations with China, because Belt and Road is so important to them. This is just fundamentally different from the work that your typical multinational does in China.
No, totally. And to illustrate that point, and I mean, from Hudson's point of view, as a scholar, I'm not picking on McKinsey, but I think their case illustrates the perils becoming so deeply intertwined with an authoritarian regime as powerful and dangerous as China. Obviously, your book is about McKinsey, so that's why we're sort of focused on them today. But the major sort of case study is a real illustration of this, isn't it? The first one that you sort of bring up in the chapter, which is about McKinsey's role in advising the China Communications Construction Company, one of these sort of central enterprises of the Chinese state. Can you tell us a bit about what McKinsey was doing with them and why? It will become apparent why this was so problematic, I think, as you talk.
Right, and so much of it is the timing of this too. So China Communications Construction Company is one of the centrally administered, state-owned enterprises in China, and it is one of the very biggest contractors and builders for the Belt and Road program around the world. It has run into some issues with corruption as well, and got into a little bit of trouble with the World Bank, and also was involved in some corruption issues in Malaysia as well, which we write about in the chapter. So McKinsey was hired by them in 2015, and we know this, and this is kind of an aside, but it's fascinating. Mostly around the world, it's difficult to find out McKinsey's clients, unless you have an internal client list, which we did. But in China, it's one of the few countries in the world where it's not that hard, because Chinese companies like to announce when McKinsey comes to their company, because it kind of burnishes their reputation. Look, somebody from McKinsey came and talked about our business model, and gave us some advice, and so that's the case with China Communications Construction. So in September of 2015, they appeared at a meeting. It was a company-wide meeting, but broadcast from Beijing, and some McKinsey consultants talked about the company strategy, organization, where it needed to go. It was very vague. So we're not exactly sure what specific advice McKinsey provided. I tried to get that. Obviously, asked McKinsey, they weren't forthcoming. And but what's fascinating about that is the timing, because the very same day they had this meeting, Jane's Defense Weekly reported that one of these islands in the South China Sea had an airstrip on it that was capable of, handling military aircraft, bombers, long-range bombers, et cetera. And it turns out, China Communications Construction was one of the principal builders of these artificial islands in the South China Sea. And here is McKinsey going to work for them. And if you're talking about corporate strategy with them, one of the things they were considering doing, China Communications in 2015, was spinning off their island building, their dredging operations, and having a stock market listing for it. So while we don't know if that specific advice was given by McKinsey, certainly that's something that could have come up with specifics on this dredging operation. But we don't know that for certain. We don't have any evidence of that. But the timing was fascinating, that they were working for this company just as they're building these islands in the South China Sea.
It is a remarkable coincidence, isn't it? And of course, at the same time, that one of the very biggest clients in the world was the Pentagon. And the US had immediately expressed concern about the militarization of the South China Sea. So you have, on the one hand, McKinsey sort of working for this company that's doing the dredging, and on the other hand, working at the highest levels of the US military or alongside them. And I think there's a good footnote, if I'm not going to annoy your publisher by sort of revealing things about in that chapter about when you were a naval officer and, you know, trying to work your ship's way through these sort of fairly shallow waters. And that the last thing on your mind was that you might bump into, you know, a Chinese artificial island bristling with long-range bombers and anti-ship weaponry as they now are. So this has all happened very quickly, and it's, you know, often because of engagement with sort of Western firms that they're able to do this kind of thing. Do you want to talk a bit about that link between McKinsey, you know, the triangle between McKinsey, the Pentagon, and Chinese companies? Because McKinsey, if I'm right, you know, there is also a bit of a revolving door with McKinsey and the government. We already mentioned Pete Buttigieg, but how does that work with the sort of national security infrastructure in the US?
So the Department of Defense, Pentagon, is a far more important client than any Chinese single client is for McKinsey. And you know, obviously the Pentagon has sounded the alarm about this island building in the South China Sea for many years now. And there are McKinsey people who go and work at the Pentagon. In one of the McKinsey partners was a senior aide to the Secretary of Defense under President Trump, Mark Esper, and so there are McKinsey people, like I said, that go into the Pentagon, and the Pentagon is so important to McKinsey. And to me, when I discovered this, and it was several years ago, we were the first to report about this in the New York Times. It really did grate me as a veteran and as somebody who had been on a guided missile cruiser going many times transiting the South China Sea. And this would have been in the 1990s. You know, the Soviet Union had collapsed. You know, the U.S. Navy ruled the waves. Sorry, Nate. And so you never really worried about China too much, even in the South China Sea. And as a navigator, I was absolutely appalled at the depths under our fathometer sometimes when we were transiting the South China Sea, how close we were to the seafloor. I was worried that our sonar dome would be an ex-sonar dome, and my career would be over as well. Anyway, that's a sea story. I don't get the chance to talk about often, so that's fun, but it really grates me, you know, and it gets to the idea that McKinsey around the world is often working for clients that have fundamentally opposed interests. In the United States, you know, what we write about extensively is the fact that McKinsey is working for pharmaceutical companies at the same time it's working for the regulator, the FDA. In this case, you know, it's also a real conflict, and there's reasons, you know, why that's happening.
No, sure. We like sea stories at Hudson Institute, by the way. You can come and tell them at any time. Wanted to return to something you mentioned earlier, which is McKinsey's role or alleged role, you know, in peddling the Belt and Road Initiative. Can you talk a bit more about what it did in Malaysia? Because this was, you know, Malaysia was not just an ordinary Belt and Road project, if there is such a thing as an ordinary Belt and Road project, because it was also the center of a $4.5 billion heist centered around the 1MDB Development Fund. Could you talk a bit about, you know, that whole scandal? And, you know, I think McKinsey's role was probably peripheral. They were on the fringes of that, but there was a role, right? So could you talk a little bit about that, please?
That's right. You know, and, you know, so this brings in China Communications Construction again, this client that they had. So in 2016, I believe, McKinsey was hired by the Malaysian government to provide some feasibility studies, economic studies on a proposed rail link that linked the east coast of peninsular Malaysia with the west coast. And this is a big infrastructure project that was envisioned, and it's under construction now. And so McKinsey did this study, and in the PowerPoint presentation, which I obtained from a Malaysian source that McKinsey put together for the Malaysian government and for this authority building this what's called the East Coast Rail Link, they had said one of the advantages of hiring a Chinese company, infrastructure company, to build this would be that it aligns with Chinese goals. China is implementing the Belt and Road policy, and this is something that is it perfectly fits with Chinese foreign policy. So it would be a great way to burnish relations with China by doing this project, and the implication being hiring a Chinese company to do it.
That's quite unusual, right? Because they like to pretend, Beijing likes to pretend that the Belt and Road is a purely commercial and good-natured, benevolent project, right? They've always denied that it's anything to do with China's foreign policy, national security, priorities. So to have that in writing in a McKinsey document is quite interesting, right?
But the people writing it are McKinsey. So it's in a way McKinsey's helping Chinese goals here, and so that's what they were doing. It turns out, and of course McKinsey said, we weren't, deliberately, we're not proselytizing Chinese policy. That's not what we do. But that's certainly what the slide is suggesting, that they were saying this is for Malaysia, this is a very good idea. And so they said this, and it turns out that this project, it came out, the contracting for it, to the awarding of this to China Communications Construction was very murky. And it came out that this may have been a way, and that the awarding of this contract and the money exchange may have been a way to recoup some of the money that had just flown out of Malaysia during this massive scandal, which you referred to, the 1MDB scandal, which is still playing out now. The main perpetrator is still at large, apparently in China. There's much more. I think there's much more on this story that still needs to be reported. Luckily, we have some of the most dogged reporters in the world, on it. But McKinsey, whether by happenstance or, maybe they say by happenstance, kind of wandered into the middle of this.
And again, not picking on McKinsey particularly, but it does illustrate the dangers of, inserting yourself into these situations as a Western firm. You're going to end up involved in massive corruption scandals, even if you're not the reason for them.
And it wasn't a secret in Malaysia in 2016 that the government there under Najib, the former prime minister, who's now been convicted of corruption, was corrupt. And so the McKinsey partners in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia knew damn well, they should have. If they didn't know that, then they were not worthy of their job, and yet they took this work.
One of the other things that caught my eye in the China chapter of your book was the way that McKinsey promoted this idea of smart cities, and part of which, a city where everything is online, the government, it's all run by AI, everything, all the public services work perfectly because then they're not down to human error or anything like that. But one of the things that includes is policing and I think what was the term used in the book, like preemptive sort of crime analysis or something like that.
Yeah.
And those terms, mean, I think you're right, those terms mean something quite different in China than they would on the streets of New York or London. Could you talk a bit about that?
Right. So one of the things, and this gets back to the first question you asked, what does McKinsey do? One of the things that they've done for decades now is propagate ideas around the world. Right now, their big thing that they're talking about is the metaverse. It's metaverse this, metaverse that. A few years ago, another idea they were touting was this idea of smart cities, not unique to China at all. And certainly in many respects, very laudable, to make cities more efficient, to put things like, electric metering, water metering, traffic management, all these things, make it, online, make it smarter, make it more efficient, save money, and make services for people better. That's all good. McKinsey was doing report after report after report on this. Translated them into Chinese. One of the areas, they focused on was policing, predictive crime, analysis, things like that. As flawed as police departments may be in Europe and America, how as much attention that they may have gotten in recent years, they are still checked by a free press, by the legal system. That's just not the case in China. And yet, they were, McKinsey, it was almost one size fits all. If they're going to be touting this in Europe and the United States, they're touting it in China as well, with some of their clients also coming on board, like Ping An Insurance, actually.
So when we talk about police and China's surveillance state, what immediately springs to mind is, the prison, the cage that has been constructed in Xinjiang to control and, as the US says, to conduct a genocide on the Uyghur people. McKinsey also has there's a bit of an icky story, an anecdote, which admittedly McKinsey has said it made a mistake in doing this. But can you talk about what happened in September 2018 in the deserts of Xinjiang?
Right. So McKinsey had a big party in Xinjiang, their annual retreat for their Greater China practice. So this would have been China, Hong Kong, Taiwan. People came to Kashgar in Western Xinjiang for their party, which was very opulent. Part of it was done right on next to the city wall there. Its theme was connecting together. They had another big party inside this, grand banquet hall that looked like a sultan's palace. It was really over the top. And it was only some of these events, especially the one by the city hall, were only a few thousand yards away from some of the detention centers that were popping up around Xinjiang at this time, detaining, up to 1 million or more, ethnic Muslim Uyghurs. And this was completely lost on the McKinsey consultants. And I think what's important to note is why it was lost on them. McKinsey in China is hyper localized. Yes, there are some foreign partners there, some people from Europe, United States, but most of their hires, most of the people doing the work are Chinese. They're elite Chinese people. They are, part of the system in many ways. And there's even a Communist Party cell, if you believe the People's Daily, that was put in the Shanghai office. That's not unusual. There are party cells in other companies as well in China. But these locals, they don't see anything wrong with that, or if they did, it certainly wasn't manifest, at this party. And to them, it may have been perfectly normal to have a party out in Xinjiang, this exotic place, kind of like, 1001 Nights kind of desert location. You can ride camels and party in the desert, which is what they did. And that is the problem, right? Because it's that kind of localism that most likely led them to take on China Communications Construction as a client, or some of these other state-owned enterprises, because to a local partner who has that ability to actually take on clients, there's nothing wrong with working for a state-owned enterprise in China. And it's not something that they would think about, I don't think, naturally, that there may be a conflict with McKinsey's work with the Pentagon if they work with China Communications Construction. So it's really the Xinjiang party that they had, which was so opulent, so over the top, was, I think, a product of that, a product of their localization and the fact that they're not thinking bigger about, some of these bigger issues, or why people may take offense or be alarmed about some of their client work in China.
It's a really important point about McKinsey's sort of business model, this hyper localization. And I wonder, because we've talked quite a bit about China now, but it's by no means the only authoritarian regime covered in your book, or corrupt government within a democracy covered in your book. Could you talk a bit about some of the other cases? I think the one that springs to mind, because McKinsey's just been charged, I think, in the last couple of weeks criminally, is South Africa. But there are other examples too, aren't there? And I wonder, is it because of this hyper-localization that they got into trouble in these places as well? Or is this a broader problem with McKinsey's business model with US firms operating in these environments generally?
Yeah. So I think South Africa is a bit different from the other ones. I'll get to that last, actually. But Saudi Arabia is very similar in a way, because McKinsey has hired some of the elites sons and daughters of ministers in Saudi Arabia. These people are not anti-regime. They're not opposed to the House of Saud, the authoritarian government there. And in Saudi Arabia's case, somebody in their Riyadh office made, another one of these slide decks that got out, and it identified some people online who were opposed or had expressed opposition to some government policies, and it finger pointed who these people were using some analysis of influence on social media. That got out. It turned out one of those people had been working with Jamal Khashoggi. So two of his brothers were arrested. Another guy who they identified was arrested. Another one, the internet account just disappeared. His account disappeared. So that's in some ways similar to their work in China. And I didn't mention also in China, they had actually hired the son-in-law of the former prime minister, Wen Jiabao. So his son-in-law, Liu Chunhang, worked at McKinsey. And it's a sign of how appealing McKinsey is to the elites. McKinsey's, it's around the world. It's such a prestigious brand, kind of like Mercedes or Porsche, people want to work there. Rich people around the world send their children there. Carlos Ghosn sent his daughters there. So it's common to, Chelsea Clinton, went to McKinsey. It's a common place for the elites to send their children to learn about business. They were working with the Azerbaijani government. They were working with Yanukovych during his campaign for president in Ukraine. This fabulously corrupt person. So they were helping with the economic plan for him. And in South Africa, they got into a lot of trouble because they got caught up and they're not alone. Some other Western companies did as well. Another consultant, Bain and Company, also has got caught up in this massive corruption scandal that's called state capture, where basically some, elements of these corrupt people were milking hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars from the South African state. And this got all the way up to the president of the country, Jacob Zuma, who had to resign. Turns out McKinsey was working with a client, and they had to take on some local partners that were involved with this state capture. And so McKinsey just a few weeks ago, very recently, was named in a criminal charge in South Africa over some of its work with a state-owned company in South Africa. So it definitely gets caught up in corrupt regimes like in Malaysia, South Africa under Zuma, and authoritarian countries. I mentioned Azerbaijan, Angola, Saudi Arabia, China. So they say, McKinsey says they've changed their client selection policy. They don't work for, the defense ministry or interior ministry or police or justice ministries for authoritarian countries anymore. They say they've, and this is in the wake of all our stories, they say they've changed the way they pick clients. And I think the question is open whether that will actually be effective in keeping them out of some of these traps that they've been in recent years.
I think that seems like a good place to finish up. We like to talk about solutions, and I suppose it's good that McKinsey is, after a barrage of stories from you and others, has eventually kind of adopted a new model, and I hope that is there anything else that can be done though? So McKinsey has it's like a new panel they have, right, with internal and external experts to sort of vet new contracts to see if they pass muster of the criteria you just set out. But is there anything the US government needs to be thinking about? I know you're a journalist, so you don't like to make sort of policy recommendations, but were there any sort of glaring loopholes that allow companies like McKinsey to get caught up in things like this that you think there's a quick fix to this if Washington wants to act?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's definitely something for policymakers. I know there's a bipartisan interest in this. It's one of these, few bipartisan areas, I think, where there's interest. And, if there, you could see a situation where there could be legislation, that said, if you're if you're going to be consulting for the U.S. Departments like the Defense Department, then you need to disclose your foreign clients. You need to disclose your work in authoritarian countries, something like that mandates disclosure. Or you need to tell us your conflicts of interests. Say if you're getting work with the FDA, well, which regulated corporations are you also working for? So maybe something like that. That's certainly up to Congress. I know there's a lot of people on Congress that have thought about this and that are interested in this on both Republicans and Democrats. So we'll have to see if there's any legislation that comes forward in the next few years about this.
Well, that's great and a good place to leave it, I think. Mike, thank you so much for your time during a busy book promotion schedule. And a really fascinating chat that I think, as we set out to do, is illustrated and illuminated, as I mentioned, those dangers of getting, being a Western firm and trying to balance all the responsibilities of that, on one hand, but and the legal obligations and things, but also trying to do business in some of the most sort of powerful, dangerous, and corrupt authoritarian regimes on earth. So, as I said, Mike is the co-author of When McKinsey Comes to Town. It's available now. It's getting rave reviews, so congratulations on those, Mike. And thank you again for your time today.
I really appreciate it, Nate.